Firstly, hello and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining today. We're really pleased to be able to deliver this session on mental well-being and COVID-19 in partnership with the American Psychological Association, also known as the APA. So my name's Wright. I'm the Head of Communications and Marketing at the PRCA here in the UK. And as I said, we're very delighted to be able to bring you some really expert panelists from the APA and indeed from the PRCA as well. So just some background on the APA first. They're the leading scientific and professional organisation representing psychology in the United States. So collectively they represent more than 121,000 researchers, educators, clinicians, consultants and students. The organisation has delivered some really outstanding work throughout the COVID-19 crisis and some brilliant resources to help professionals across all industries deal with the effects of COVID-19, and I'm sure we'll be touching on some of those in our discussion today. So I'm very pleased to be joined by four excellent panelists. Our panelists are Alicia Aebersold, who's the APA's Chief Communications Officer, Vaile Wright, PhD, Psychologist, Senior Director of Healthcare Innovation at the APA, Lynn Bufker, PhD, Senior Director of Practice Transformation and Quality at the APA, and the PRCA's Neha Katwani, our Public Affairs and Policy Manager who oversees the PRCA's mental health work. Before we kick off, just a reminder that we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible, and we'd really encourage you, as many of you as possible, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to ask questions of our panelists. I'm going to hand over now to Alicia, who's going to share a few thoughts on how the pandemic has impacted PR professionals. And then from that point on, we'll kick off with a bit of a discussion. And as I said, do feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box. So with that in mind, Alicia, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, Corey. It's such a privilege to be here today talking to all of you with these amazing panelists as part of an ongoing collaboration with PRCA and the American Psychological Association to reach and support PR practitioners across the globe. As Corey said, my name is Alicia Aebersold. I am the Chief Communications Officer for APA, which is a scientific and professional organization with around 120,000 members. And the mission is to support the advancement of communication and application of psychological science to benefit society and improve lives. I like how communication is right there in the mission. I think that's very important. I've been doing work in communications for associations and nonprofits for 25 years, and I think it's just a fascinating field. I love being able to ensure the work of smart people, passionate people, gets out into the hands of people who are going to most benefit from it. But in all my time in the field of communications, I've never seen anything like this. So let me tell you a little bit, just very quickly for a minute, about my personal approach to being a PR practitioner during a global pandemic. First, I'm working nonstop, moving at light speed. I'm overbooked and overcommitted. Second, I am not at all separating my work from my life. And third, I am completely overconsuming both news and snacks. So clearly I am not a personal shining example of how to cope. And I'm imagining that many of you can connect with some of the ways that I'm not coping. Before COVID, APA was working extraordinarily hard to educate policymakers and the public on issues ranging from the trauma inflicted on children when they're separated from their families, to the impact on communities of gun violence, to the psychological impact of climate change. And that includes a great deal of work on behalf of the profession of of course, from pushing for increased research funding to advocating for better payment models to ensuring psychological expertise is front and center in America's workplaces. And all of that continued after COVID hit, albeit from our individual homes. So like you, we're juggling our pets and our families and spotty Wi-Fi, but the workload didn't go down, also like you, quite the opposite. COVID made APA's expertise even more relevant. So we elevated our messaging and added content on everything from distance learning to physical isolation to the stress of being in financial crisis. We put out advice for parents who have children with disabilities specific to COVID. We have lesson plans for psychology teachers who are working remotely. We have a host of content around grief and loss, and we have an entire initiative on helping clinicians move their practices to telehealth. And then George Floyd was brutally murdered, and people started waking up to the deeply rooted, long-standing pandemic of racism. And then the workload grew again. And the weight on our team, especially people of color, grew much, much heavier. APA launched national town hall meetings and efforts to speak directly to Black men about the traumas they're facing now and have always faced. We added a web page called Unmute that encourages people of color to let themselves talk about what they're feeling with others and with professionals. We're launching a task force on police violence and a community where psychologists of color and others can share their expertise and ideas. And everybody, I think, is very proud of the work that we're doing. But to do the kind of work my team and everyone on this call does in a time of unprecedented global crisis is really the perfect storm of stress. And I think there's sort of three ways that that's true. The first is that the drumbeat is constant. And this is always true for PR, you all know that, but it's exacerbated by the situations that we're facing. The ebb and flow of news events requires us to stay in a heightened awareness mode, pivot our strategies with little warning, rethink our approaches as events change. We can't choose to shut out the news to help us cope because the news is our job. And as things evolve, we have to evolve the way we communicate about them. So for instance, APA has been educating people about the impact of stress through our annual Stress in America survey for the past 13 years. And every year the findings help us elevate awareness of the levels of stress in the United States around key subjects or issues, and then educate about the impact of stress and how to cope. And Lynn and Vaile are constantly in the news having these conversations over and over again, the impact of stress and how to cope, the impact of stress and how to cope. And the specifics of that just shift with the survey. So for instance, last year we found that more than a third of Americans said that the fear of mass shootings was keeping them from going to certain places or events. That's certainly a heady kind of stress for people to be facing. So after the COVID came, we pivoted the survey. Now we're putting it out and releasing our data regularly so we can track stress levels. And last month, we found the stress on parents during COVID was higher than for any other group. And later this week, we're going to be releasing the next round of data, which is going to show continued dramatic but unsurprising increases in stress and how people are coping. It's also the perfect storm of stress for PR practitioners, not only because that drumbeat is constant, but because the scope is widening. The messages we're sending are on track with the messages we were sending, but the people who need to hear them are coming from a wider pool. APA's focus on issues like isolation, fear, and grief, healthy workplaces are all deeply relevant and require us to find new ways to reach audiences or new ways to react to the audiences that are reaching out to us. That means that as the scope continues to widen, so does the workload and so does the pressure. And I know that is something that all of you are feeling. And finally, communication experts at APA and in many other places are facing that sort of perfect storm of stress because visibility breeds visibility. And I know that that's the goal of communications. That's why we do this work. But it's important to note that it comes with more workload and more pressure. For instance, APA worked with the My Brother's Keeper Alliance. That's an Obama Foundation initiative that's focused on building safe and supportive communities for men and boys of color. Since our CEO's voice appeared on that same virtual stage with President Obama, which is, from a PR perspective, that's a great win, right? Our CEO is getting so many invitations to appear in other events and outlets. We're getting so many opportunities to speak about issues of mental health in the Black community. It's fantastic and a great success to reach those communities, but it's also a sudden, deeper focus that requires staff to shift their approaches and shuffle workloads, and it's all additive, all of it. So in this time when the word unprecedented is vastly overused, I would use it for us, for PR and communications. Communications people are facing a time of unprecedented stress, even as we do this really important work that we all love. As experts in communicating with our constituencies about what matters, we focus on strategy and tactics. And so today, when you're listening to these three amazing experts, I want you to think about what they are offering to you. They're speaking your language. They're going to give you strategies and tactics. They're going to give you advice from science that you can use to help yourself, advice that can help you better understand what your colleagues are facing, people around you, and also help you better deliver what your clients need because you better understand how to cope and how to understand what they're facing in this overused but truly unprecedented time. For me, being able to work in this field is a gift, and I am so grateful to have that. People around me that I have who are so good at what they do, and we support each other in trying to get through this. And I also know that getting control over stress and using better coping mechanisms and better understanding and supporting all of those people around me is going to make me better at the work I do. It's going to make me more effective in delivering these messages to broader and wider audiences. So I'm going to be listening as well to Neha and Lynn and Vaile. And thanks for having me, Corey.
Thank you very much for that, Alicia. That was very insightful. And I think your description of a perfect storm of stress is something that I think all of our members are identifying with, and it's certainly what our research is pointing to as well. You mentioned that Lynn and Vaile and Neha will be able to discuss some tips. So I think it'd be nice to move on to perhaps hear from Lynn first on what advice you can share really for individuals who are faced in these extreme circumstances of having to deal with stress and on so many different levels, and what can individuals do to promote their mental health? Where can they start?
I was going to ask you, how much time do I have to answer that question, because that could take our entire session, right? It's really a critical question for people who have not been thinking about their mental health. The time is now. We absolutely need to be thinking about what do we need. When we feel stressed and overwhelmed, that's a sign that the demands on us are exceeding our resources for managing it. So to the extent that we can put some brakes on some of the demands, even temporarily, becomes really critical. So then we can take that time to do the things to take care of ourselves. We need to have a reasonable foundation of adequate sleep and nutrition and hydration, physical activity, and social connection in order to go about our world. But when we are feeling that everything we're doing is so critical and so important, we often cut corners in those domains. We have the snacks super handy, as I do in my home office, or we sleep less. We shave off 30 minutes or an hour, or we decide, oh, I can skip the workout today. But it's really when we're stressed and overwhelmed that it becomes critical to do those things for our overall well-being. It would be ideal if you had good practices in that arena prior to feeling stressed and overwhelmed, because it's easier to maintain them when they become habits in that way. But when they're not habits in that way, looking at what you're doing now and trying to look at those areas, where am I cutting short for myself? And trying to build those back in. Vaile and I have been talking about this with so many different groups. We actually hold each other a little accountable on some of these things, whether or not we got a workout in, or did we take a break? Did we connect with somebody? And that's helpful too, to have somebody that you can help to serve as your buddy on this, to encourage you to get that workout in, to take the time to connect with somebody where you're not talking about the stresses of the world, but maybe you're indulging it's spring moving into summer here. I spent the entire weekend gardening, and I can talk about that with somebody else who shares that interest. And that's just really nice to do that, to disconnect from the pressures that we have. So that's really the basis of where you want to start. But there's so many additional things that we hope we'll have a chance to talk about today, to give you some ideas about how you might find little spaces in what you're dealing with that allow you to do the things to take care of yourself, so that ultimately you can be more effective in all the roles you're in, whether it is as a PR and communications professional, whether it's as a partner, a parent, a sibling, a friend. When you take the time for yourself, it allows you then to bring more of yourself to these other kinds of roles that you're in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think all of the prioritizing those healthy habits inevitably will improve all aspects of your role, but particularly at a time like this, when what's required of us is so demanding, and it will allow us to kind of bring our best selves to the role. Vaile, is that something that you would agree with, I imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, where we fall short is we try to just rely on willpower, right? Just sort of this idea that we'll say we'll do it, and then we'll do it. And then something, another email comes, or a phone call happens, or somebody wants you to look at this. And before you know it, it's 9 o'clock at night, and you didn't do the things you said you were going to do. So I think in addition to having an accountability partner like Lynn talked about, it's critical to use your resources around you, like your schedule. Block off time in your schedule to prioritize and use that as a priority for what you want to do. So I know that I am most successful. Working out is obviously a big thing for Lynn and I, when I put it on my schedule. And I just say, I'm not going to be available for this hour. I'm going to work out this hour. And then it actually happens. Same thing with, getting enough sleep or taking breaks from your devices. Don't just say, I'm going to take a break from my device and put it on your coffee table. Put it in a different room. keep it far away from you so that you can really take that hour to not be checking email, to not be scrolling through social media. Because again, while it's important to stay informed and involved, we do have to take breaks. We know that being constantly connected to our devices increases our stress. We have data on that. So we really need to be thinking about ways that you can effectively and successfully take breaks, even when it is such a big part of our jobs.
Thank you, Vaile. And Neha, from the point of view of PR professionals, how important do you think it is for us to create those separations, as Vaile was referring to, and prioritize mental well-being across the board?
Yeah, I just want to start with sort of some research that we've conducted. And our research suggests that 89% of PR practitioners have struggled with their mental health at some point in the last 12 months. And now we're adding the stress of a global pandemic on top of all of that. Our research also shows that the majority of PR practitioners find their job very stressful. And a lot of this stress is caused by their workload. And people are also not taking the time off if they're stressed because of their workload. So we have this vicious cycle in which people are stressed out because they have too much to do, but also feel like they can't take time off, which is really, it's a very toxic environment to be in. And we're currently running a piece of research that specifically looks at the impact of COVID on people's well-being. So please complete that and we'll share the link. That would really help us. And I think the stress has definitely been amplified during the pandemic because you have to consider that a number of people have been furloughed. I think our research suggests that 60% of the industry in the UK have furloughed staff. And the boundaries between work and home are a little bit more blurred. So I think the presenteeism is at an all-time high, and people are working overtime. And what I would say, for me, it's important to set boundaries and focus on a few small things that can improve your well-being. I know that there's a lot of advice out there on how to manage your mental health, and it can be overwhelming. So trying to incorporate meditation, exercise, virtual catch-ups, all of that into a full workday, and having to care for children or elderly parents can be exhausting, and it can often have the opposite effect. So I would, suggest that avoid the sort of social media and Instagram trap where you're comparing yourself to other people and seeing what they're doing, because it can be quite triggering. I know for me, like Lynn and Vaile, I enjoy working out, and that's what helps me sort of decompress. And I have sort of hard stops in my workday to accommodate that, but that might not work for everyone. And it can be very triggering to see people doing, these incredible workouts at home. But just figure out what works for you, and again, hold yourself accountable. Maybe ask the people you live with to hold you accountable, or ask a friend to check in on you. And also talk to your employer about flexibility, because we're in a situation where a lot of people are now working at home with their kids or are caring for elderly parents, and that 9-to-5 schedule won't work for them. So flexibility is key. And if you're struggling to maintain your current work schedule, talk to your employer. And I think as employers, we need to sort of accommodate that flexibility.
Thank you, Neha. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. I think the point about boundaries and separating work and personal, and the difficulties around that in the current circumstance. Lynn and Vaile, really interested to get your thoughts on what advice you can share for practitioners in those situations, because we know in our own industry that those circumstances are widespread. So what advice could you share for people in those situations?
Yeah, there's a few different things I can start off. If you're able, it's really critical to try to set aside workspace that's separated from your personal space. And there's a few different ways you can do that. One is just making sure that you have a dedicated workspace where people know when you're there that you're working, and that ideally, if it's possible, to not interrupt you, and to set some boundaries around that. So it means that when you're taking personal Zoom calls, you take them in a different room, right? So again, to sort of separate out this sense of this is workspace, this is personal space. And ideally, your workspace isn't in your bedroom. Your bedroom is really a place where you ought to save for just sleep and for being intimate. And if you start conflating work in there too, it's not a very relaxing space. Now, of course, depending on what your situation is, all this sounds really great, but can be really challenging, right? Maybe you've got kids who needed workspace, you have a spouse or a partner that's there needing workspace, or you just don't have that much space and you have a roommate who also needs space. So I think being flexible and making sure that you are having these conversations with your employer and saying, look, I can put, work time aside here, but then I've got to give up this space to somebody else, but knowing that you're going to work again later. So there's a little bit of negotiation around that. I think that has to happen. But I think to get to the sense of the challenges with boundaries and separating the space out is really asking yourself, where is this pressure to work so much coming from? Is it external or is it internal? I think a lot of times it's internal, that we feel like we have to keep working and have to keep working. And we're not setting up boundaries. And I think we need to ask ourselves, do I really need to be doing the things that I'm doing? Or can I actually take some of these breaks? And if the pressure is coming from externally, then I think our leaders need to be really thinking about how they're setting up maybe not workplaces that aren't supporting the well-being of their employees. And we need to be communicating messages as leaders that it is okay to take breaks, it's okay to take time off, it is as just important to take care of our well-being and our emotional health as it is our physical health.
I think that's a really interesting point about the pressure coming internally, because I think especially in public relations and communications, we're very much an output-focused industry. We're doing busy things, writing press releases or posting on social media. It's a very intense, activity-focused industry, and I think reminding ourselves that very, very often that pressure comes from ourselves as practitioners is a really key point. And as you rightly say, it's for leaders to reiterate that and to drive home the point that people need time out to take those breaks and prioritize their well-being. Lynn, is that something that you'd agree with?
Oh, definitely. And when you were talking about that, I was thinking, I joke around with my colleagues sometimes, I'm going to stop being good, because I'm sure those of you who are good at your jobs, you get asked to do more, right? And I always joke around, well, I'm going to stop being good, so they stop asking me to do anything else. But of course, that's not internally not how I function. And in an era when there are people losing their positions, of course you want to be good, you want to maintain your position. So I think it becomes important to remind leadership, or remind yourself if the pressure is coming from within, that we actually have really good data that says people who work like 10, 12 hours a day really aren't producing better quality work than people who are working sort of 8-hour day, for instance. I mean, I don't have the exact numbers on that, but the point is more and more hours of work does not necessarily equate to better work product. And so having those boundaries around when you're working and what you're doing and structuring your time so you're focused on what's critical really does make a difference. And sometimes those boundaries might be you close the laptop and you walk away from it. And that's a signal that you're done for a time being. Or you, as Vaile was saying, you put the cell phone in another room. You don't look at it for a while. If we don't have the space to sort of physically walk away from our workspace, we have to make it very clear to ourselves that our work time is ended for a little bit, so that we can take that time to return to whatever engages us, so that when we return to work, we're mentally on top of it.
Thank you. Alicia, at the beginning, you mentioned that you didn't feel you were doing a particularly great job of separating priorities, but I just wondered if you could reflect on your own experience of juggling those priorities and perhaps share any lessons you might have learned that you wish you'd known, say, 2-3 months ago.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been good at protecting staff. So, for instance, I have a rule that I don't send emails in the evenings. I write emails in the evenings, but I send them to the mornings, because I don't think it's fair for people who do have their phone by their bed to get a buzz from their supervisor late at night and feel a need to respond. I learned that lesson from being the person on the responding side of my supervisor in other jobs. So I think it's really important, if you're in a leadership position, to take extraordinary measures to protect your staff, to encourage them to take breaks, to ensure that you're asking them about their workload in a way that feels safe, that they can answer it, and not expect them to come to you and say, I have too many things on my plate, especially now when people are extra worried. I think it's really important to model breaks. So we, like APA, sort of gave a mental health day last month. It was Friday on what was going to be a 3-day weekend for Memorial Day, and the CEO put out a note and said, we're going to be closing on Friday. And in the note it said, it's my expectation supervisors do not reach out to their staff, do not engage with staff. And as far as I could tell, the majority of people followed it. And that really, it was kind of a sea change, I think, for the organization to feel like everybody got kind of a 4-day break. And that was really a good thing. I mean, for me, I have kids and I adore them, and a husband I adore. And so we take, I'm done at a certain time every night, and I close my laptop and we make dinner together and we go for a family walk. And we've gotten the kids hooked on Modern Family. So we've been binge watching, an episode a night or something, but sometimes we'll play a family game or do something together. But that time for me is very sacred. So we all leave our phones in the kitchen. I don't respond, because I know that those urgent things are blowing up. Texts are still going to be there in 3 hours when I go back. So I think for me, it's definitely figuring out not only how to protect yourself, but how to model it and protect others. Even if I am sending an email late at night when I shouldn't be, trying not to imply to anyone that I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, I think so much of so many of these challenges relate to workplace culture, don't they? And trying to establish a healthy workplace culture with regards to mental health. So just thinking from an employer's point of view, or a line manager's point of view, Lynn, perhaps if I could start with you, what tips would you have for people in those positions about protecting the well-being of those that they work with?
Like Alicia said, I haven't figured out how to delay my email sending, but I've been very clear with everybody who works for me that if I send an email in the evening and during hours when you're not working, I don't expect you to respond. So I definitely been very clear about that, and I check in with my team members regularly about how they're doing, encourage them to take breaks and use their PTO. We're flexible in our organization. I've talked with everyone about ideal hours for work and have talked about giving them flexibility. I have, one person on my team who has had now 2 family members diagnosed with COVID. So she's been managing a lot of doctor's calls and trying to take care of all that. And we've talked about take the PTO, take the time off, or in her case, she would rather use work to distract her from those things. So just talked about if work happens, it happens, right? So trying to be as flexible as I can about not expecting people to be completely available 8:30 to 5, but also allowing a fair amount of flexibility for those who might need to work in the evening because they're managing childcare and other kinds of other issues during the day. We also are still trying to keep our tradition of recognizing people's birthdays, even though we're doing it via Zoom. We're terrible singing happy birthday over Zoom, but we do it anyway. And the birthday celebree seems to appreciate the effort, if not the lack of tunefulness. So we try to keep those sort of rituals and traditions that have been important to our team going, even though we're doing it in a virtual way. And we have joked around, I think at this point we have probably, 4 or 5 cakes that we need to have to celebrate various accomplishments, milestones, etc. among us. So finding ways to use the technology to cultivate similar kinds of recognition and support. We have a recognition system through our organization that we are still using. It sends e-cards to individuals, it copies their supervisor. So it's a nice way to let a colleague in another unit know you appreciated what they did, and lets their supervisor know. So we're trying to continually think about how to do that. I've been encouraging my team to think about that because it feels great to be recognized, but you know what? It also feels really good to recognize someone else, because they're having a hard time too managing everything. And it feels really nice to let someone know that. Sharing the good, the positive with others is a nice thing to do. So I try to model that And I'm trying to be much more explicit in talking about the value of that so that others will think about it and do that in their day-to-day work life as well.
Thank you. And Vaile, were there any other tips that you would like to share with line managers and employers?
Yeah, I think it's important that leaders model calmness and, in approaching the work in a balanced kind of way. If you are stressed and you are anxious and you are, snapping at your employees or, exuding this sort of an inability to handle it, then they're going to pick up on that too. Right. So it's very similar to being parents. Like as parents, we also need to be modeling approaching stressful situations in a calm way because children pick up on our emotions. But again, in order to be able to do that, to be able to stay calm during this level of stress and model that for our employees, we have to be taking care of ourselves. If we don't practice what we preach and engage in some level of self-care, then we cannot keep our emotional well-being on track. And so we have to take those opportunities to take care of ourselves as leaders and then model that and encourage others to do the same.
And I think keeping calm and being flexible are two really, really important traits to have in public relations in normal times. But I think in the current crisis, there's an even greater need for those attributes, particularly amongst senior leaders. Neha, is there anything that you'd like to share on thinking specifically about the issues that PR professionals are having to deal with at the moment, and what advice you might have for practitioners in tricky situations?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that we found through our research is that practitioners, even though they acknowledge that they're suffering with their mental health, and a lot of that is caused by workload, they often are unwilling to talk about senior management because they feel like it might jeopardize their career. And I think that's one thing that we really need to tackle. If you don't have an open and transparent culture in which you can talk about your mental health openly, that's not going to let staff at junior positions approach senior management. So it really starts with culture. And I think, and a lot of practitioners may talk to their colleagues, and there needs to be that sort of open culture in which these issues are being recognized, and staff can sort of approach senior management and say, listen, I'm really struggling. This is what's going to help me cope. And I think the thing that we need to learn from all of this is that you just have to listen to your employees, and line managers should be regularly checking in with employees to see how they can be supported. We also have to understand that everyone is coping differently right now. Not everyone is struggling with working remotely. Some people may actually be thriving in this environment. So it's really about listening and finding ways in which everyone can be supported. And I think these are things that we should be doing regardless of a pandemic, but it's especially important right now. And I think daily check-ins or asking senior management to block out their calendar in which staff can be like, okay, I'm available from these hours. If you need to speak about anything, feel free to reach me. Having that sort of open and transparent communication is so important. And, staff surveys can be incredibly powerful right now if people want to make sort of anonymous contributions. I think the feedback and the communication needs to be at an all-time high right now to see how people can be supported. And for me, I appreciate that, Alicia, you delay sending emails outside of work hours, because obviously you have to work flexibly, but I think, everyone is working differently right now, but having a blanket ban on emails going out between sort of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., that's powerful, because even if, Alicia is drafting these emails outside of work hours, it doesn't mean that she wants people to respond. And I think setting that culture from the very top is so important. And I think, most of the things that we're working on can probably wait until the next morning, and that's what we really need to communicate. That I've never seen an emergency that really needs to be sort of remedied right now. So I think it's just about being flexible and having that communication with employees.
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of the culture in PR is that everything has to have happened an hour ago. So So it's definitely something that I think we need to confront as an industry. We've had a question come in on the Q&A about redundancies. So it's been fairly well known that Edelman, the world's largest PR agency, have laid off a large number of staff. And the question that we've been asked is, what about those organisations like Edelman and other agencies who are facing a downturn in work and potentially facing redundancies or having to plan for them as a senior leader, and stresses and impacts to mental health beyond workload? For this could be a brand new type of stress that is particularly difficult. Vaile, Lynn, would you have any response to that, and perhaps some advice for senior people who are in those difficult situations?
Yeah, my role at the organization has not been to be the person who's making those kinds of decisions. So I'm certainly on the end of a staff who's wondering, and how does that happen, right? This is a terrible time to have to face a layoff, any sort of redundancy, because it is a really tough job market. And if you read the papers and read the business section, you're seeing how the dramatic impacts this is going to have on the global economy, and what's really going to happen to business in the long term. So I think it's important to recognize that these are possibilities, to do what one can to protect oneself, whether it's likely to happen to you or to others on your team, in terms of thinking about your financial management, your planning, those kinds of things, to recognize that it's not about your quality and worth in terms of your contributions, right? It's really because work pace may have slowed, revenues may have lessened, there's less need for the kind of work. So one has to respond to the situation and figure out how to cope with it. That's critical, because you need to figure out how to pay rent and pay bills and things like that. But it's going to be much more complicated if you're spending a good amount of your energy on, where did I fail? What did I screw up? How did I make this happen to me? Instead of recognizing that in most instances, the likelihood, it has far more to do with the global economy and the impact that all of this is having on work right now, and much less about you as a productive worker. But if you get wrapped up in that kind of thinking as well, it's going to further complicate your ability to think, how do I move forward and deal with a really tough situation? Going backwards, then it becomes really critical for those who have to make these difficult decisions to do everything they can to try to protect individuals who have had their positions eliminated because of global financial pressures, to do things like, can we provide a particularly beneficial severance package, continued health insurance coverage for a period of time, resume building skills, coaching, things like that, to try to help with the transition, and to communicate as clearly as possible to the individuals who may have their positions changed, and to the staff who are left, about the measures that were taken to try to avoid this kind of situation, how the organization might plan for the future in order to avoid these kinds of really difficult challenges, because having reductions in staff affects everyone. Mm-hmm. Clearly, it's going to have a significant impact on the people who lost their position, because now they're trying to figure out, how do I do my mortgage, my rent, pay my bills? But it really affects the people, the coworkers as well, because they feel very afraid and scared, and perhaps even terrified about maybe something's going to happen to them as well. So being as clear and transparent, Neha was talking about that, in terms of how you manage on the line, this is critical with these kinds of situations, to let people know what's happened, how we're trying to address the situation, how we want to go forward so we can avoid this kind of situation in the future, and to help individuals who are impacted by these decisions to understand that it's really not about them. I mean, in some instances, perhaps there have been some challenges with particular employees, but for the most part, it's about a business and economic decision. And it becomes very hard to think about how to move forward if you're stuck on feeling like, where did I fail? What did I do wrong? How could I have done this differently? And if you're spending your time and energy thinking about that, it becomes harder then to put the energy towards, how do I move forward? So, so making those communications so people aren't jumping to that kind of thinking becomes really critical in the transition, because it's very painful and difficult for everyone involved. Nobody wants to have to make those decisions. Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of it. And the colleagues who are sitting with it have the significant distress and feel overwhelmed by it as well.
I think, yeah, that's a really powerful point. And there's obviously a really key part of modern communications is for leaders to speak authentically and with feeling, and to ensure that there's a human element to everything that they're working on, particularly on a really tricky issue like redundancy. So I think there's a real balance there to be struck between being empathetic and genuinely caring, but also seeing the bigger picture, in that a lot of the time leaders themselves are not responsible for the current circumstance. So I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. Vaile, are there any other tips that you think you'd like to share with agency bosses who are in that difficult situation of having to make redundancies?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lynn tackled a lot of kind of that sense of how to approach it. I think for me, what has struck me about this situation is the unending ways in which additional stressors keep coming, right? Like there's just a lot of uncertainty, and I don't think we know what this is going to look like going forward as places start to reopen. What will be the new stressors that come from that? As the economy continues to tumble, what will be the new stressors that come from that? What will schools do? So I think in the midst of all these different, how we handle redundancies within our organization, I think what's critical is that we remind ourselves to focus on what's in our control, and to try to let go of the things that are not in our control that we're worrying about, whether that's the economy or what have you. And when we can focus on what's in our control, then we can really utilize our resources to both take care of ourselves, but also to problem solve. If that's the case, then if whatever the case may be, if we're the ones being let go or we're the ones having let people go. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things to remind ourselves is that we are really resilient as people. Humans are very resilient. People have lost jobs before. People have overcome lots of different adversities, whether it's divorce or loss of a loved one. And we do, even in the moment, if we don't feel like we're going to come through, we do generally come through. So trying to remind ourselves of that as well, that through adversity we can grow and learn, and it isn't going to feel like this forever, even though it feels like this right now.
Thank you. We've had a few more questions from the attendees. Kelly McGuire has asked, should people who are juggling roles, for example, childcare at home, homeschooling, or looking after relatives, be given more time off than those who do not have dependents? And how do you balance that and create a fair playing field? Alicia, do you have any thoughts on that as a senior communications professional, on how to approach that subject?
Yeah, I think that is a really difficult question. And I think it's one of those questions that every organization has to think about themselves, sort of what their capacity is, what their workforce looks like, what the best way to balance it. I think there are a lot of ways where you can figure out ways to support people who have more to juggle. And I think, Lynn was mentioning some of those. You can do different kinds of hours. Somebody could go onto a schedule where they're working 4 days a week and they get a day off. Or I have one employee who works early in the morning, and when school was in, she would work early in the morning and then sort of log off work and be available to help her child during the school day, and then log back in later in the day, and then work a few hours maybe over the weekend in the morning when her kids were asleep, to sort of catch up to the work. And that but we came to that we figured that out together. It was sort of based on what she wanted. Other options are to let people take more leave than you normally let them take, or if your organization does administrative leave, you could come up with some kind of policy for that. I know of friends who work for companies where they do pooled leave, and people can ask, draw from the pool, so employees donate their leave. So I think a lot of it depends on the culture of your organization, the number of employees you have, kind of what they're looking for. And I would start with what Neha was saying, with asking the employees, surveying them, asking them individually. I think that's true for all kinds of ways that we're trying to support employees now, is figuring out what support looks like to them. And management may think support looks like something that feels fake and is unhelpful. And employees may really, if you ask them, may say they need a different kind of support. And a lot of times, at least what I'm hearing from people at APA, is flexibility is of a higher value than any of these sort of other things that you might pull off of a HR folder that you want to be giving people. Flexibility, and especially around things like Lynn was saying, if you have medical issues or someone that you love has medical issues, or you have, like Kelly is describing here, sort of juggling responsibilities. So I would say ask your employees what they really want, and then figure out the best way you can deliver it that works with your company's culture.
Yeah, and we just
Sorry. I was going to say, the question of fairness comes up so often, right? So you may have a colleague who really has kids at home or sick family members or whatever, and somebody who's got, maybe lives with a partner, both are healthy, both are working. The person who doesn't have the extra stress may feel like, well, that's not really fair. They're getting to do all these extra things here. So talk with those colleagues too. Help them understand. You can't really reveal what's happening with another colleague's situation, although they may have talked to each other, but check in with them as well, so that you can assess whether there's concerns about feeling unfair in terms of the workload and the balance and things like that. So you want to make sure that you're really tuning into every employee, even the ones who seem like they have it together and maybe don't have pressures, because you don't want to have building resentment over what they're perceiving as differences in how colleagues are being treated or expectations, but want to ensure that you're providing the kind of environment where everyone can be as successful in their work as they can be.
Thank you. The questions are coming thick and fast now. So another one that we've received relates to morale. So how do we keep remaining employees, those who are still in employment? How do we keep them around? How do we keep them motivated while other employees are resigning because of huge pay cuts or getting offers from other companies? I think it was Lynn that touched on kind of keeping the traditions going and really kind of doing the things that you would do ordinarily in a company, but transferring as many of those initiatives online. Do any of you have any thoughts on what techniques or initiatives employees can do to retain and improve morale at this time?
I mean, I think that a lot of it has to do, especially because we're all working at home, with connection. So Lynn's suggestions are such good ones about maintaining those traditions, that figuring out new ways, different ways for employees to connect, letting them figure out ways to do it themselves, I think is so important. We use Microsoft Teams at APA, and we built some staff built a team water cooler, basically like a break room, where people can go in. There's separate channels where you can talk about your pets, and you can talk about games you're playing, or you can connect with people around non-work. There's even non-work issues. I think there's even one called non-COVID zone, where you're only allowed to talk about things that are cheerful. I know that we're doing virtual like Pilates and yoga, and that people can sign up for. We started a pen pal program where people can sign up for the program, and you can get matched with someone else in the organization who you don't otherwise know, and you can actually write physical letters to one another to offer some support. And all of those suggestions came from employees who were coming up with ideas about ways to connect. And I think connection definitely helps with morale. I think the other thing that helps with morale that communication professionals have a role in is transparency. And it's what Nihal was saying earlier, just more communication more often, trying to ensure that you're answering their questions in a way that you're not just answering the question for one person, but you're ensuring those answers are available to everyone, tamping down rumors. All of those things I think can be really helpful. And I will say that the mental health day off definitely was a morale boost the week that we did that.
Absolutely.
Sometimes little surprises like that.
And I think it also really helps to be really concrete and specific and provide even more positive feedback than you might normally, right? You might think that your team knows they do a good job. Tell them. Tell them very clearly, tell them directly, let your colleagues know when you really appreciate something that they did, because nobody wants to feel like they're working in a vacuum. Nobody wants to feel like what they're doing is unnoticed and unappreciated. And there's the potential in a virtual world for it to feel that way, to seem that way. So I think those in the position of being acknowledgers need to step it up. I really do think that's a critical task for people to say, I really appreciated how you acted so responsibly to this member, how you followed up with this, great piece of writing on this. I'm so grateful for the idea. Be really concrete and specific about that to let people know what you see, that you see what they're doing, and that what they're doing is good and contributes to the overall purpose of the organization.
Great, thank you for that, Lynn. One of the other things that's coming into a lot of people's minds now is about the phased return to work, and I know certainly in the Western economies now we're kind of shifting our focus more towards getting back into the office, or resuming some sort of office-based working. Vaile, do you have any advice for employers on how to manage that process with their employees, and any issues in particular that they need to be mindful of when communicating those?
Yeah, I think it again comes back to this sense of clear, consistent, science-based communication. So really making sure that you're following the recommendations that are being put out around how to safely reopen and how to safely go back to the workplace, and that you're really listening to employees about their comfort level with doing so, and then honoring the space that they're at. So I think similar to how different people are probably coping with this in different ways, we certainly know that different people are more comfortable with the reopening process and going back to work than others are. And that's okay. It's okay to not be in the same space as a coworker might be, or as your manager might be. So I think we need to be really transparent and clear in our communication, and getting a sense of where are people's comfort levels, how do we do this in a safe way, and how do we continue to reevaluate, right? And keep thinking about what steps have we taken to move forward, and are they the right ones? Do we need to change things up? And ensuring that people have the resources that they need to continue to be effective wherever they're at, whether they're in the workplace, in an actual workplace, or continuing to work from home.
Thank you. And again, this might be another one for you, Vaile, or indeed for you, Lynn. I think as professionals now, we're in a position where we're about to experience significant disruption again in the way that we did earlier in the year. And people have situations where their kids may still be at home, or they may be going back to school, or they may be returning to the office themselves. Are there any tips that you can share with individuals on how to kind of look after their own well-being, but also just remain productive throughout that kind of severe disruption and period of change? What things can we do to look after ourselves?
Vaile had made the important point that as psychologists we talk about all the time. You can't control everything. You need to identify the things that are within your control and to focus on those things. When it comes back to the idea of returning to whatever our new normal will be, right? Some people may find that telework really works for them. That may be a time to advocate for yourself and for your position, and talk about how you can continue being an effective contributing employee from a largely telework position. There may be things that a return to an office could be challenging for you. I take public transportation to get to work. That's a real concern for me in this era. So I would be thinking about how can I do that in the most safest way, way that's going to minimize my potential for transmission of virus. So I'm going to be thinking about those kinds of things. So you do want to do anticipatory planning for the kinds of things that you have some capacity to do something about, but also trying to keep it open to what are the possibilities now that we've seen what telework looks like and how we can do it well, in order to balance those kinds of questions also. I think that for many, the expectation that everyone will be in the office on a full-time basis is gone from here on out. We've shown how telework can work and it can be effective, and there will be benefits for organizations to adopt that. But some individuals really want to be in the workplace. And so I think it's again going to go back to how do we address what are the individual needs of workers as well as the overall need of the organization, and thinking that through. Hopefully, if we've got good, clear, transparent communication, individuals are in a position where they can do a little self-advocacy about what they think will be effective for them in the work that they're doing, and be proactive in talking with their manager about what is it you would want from me in order to demonstrate that this path is going to be an effective path for the kind of work that I'm doing. You've seen what's been happening so far. What would we need to do for the future so that there can be a bit of a plan going forward, so that it's not completely surprised, like, ooh, Monday I'm going back to work. What am I going to do here? But to the extent that you can have some sense of when this might unfold from both your own end and what that's going to mean in terms of transportation or childcare or whatever you need to readjust to, as well as from the employer end.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, and we've only got a few minutes remaining, so I'd like to, if possible, just run by each of the panelists, and maybe if you could just offer a few closing thoughts and share any final tips for our attendees on prioritizing mental health at this time. Vaile, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I kind of want to piggyback on that last question too, and this notion of productivity. I think we kind of need to throw that out the window right now. I think we need to be managing our expectations about what productivity ought to look like, and I think we need to be cutting ourselves some slack. I think none of us in our adult lives ever expected to go through something like this. And I don't think that there is a rule book for how to do this right. I think we can just do the best that we can. And reminding yourself of that is going to be okay. And recognizing there are going to be ebbs and flows and ups and downs, right? I might have a really super productive week, and then the next week, I feel like I can't get anything done. And sort of acknowledging that that's just our reality right now and accepting it doesn't mean I have to like it. But there's a level of acceptance that we all need to get to right now, that this is how it is. And once we can accept and stop fighting our reality, then again, we can then take those resources to identify the things that are in our control and figure out how we're going to be as resilient as possible. So I think and we have to model that as parents, we need to model that as leaders and employers, and we need to be modeling that for our partners and our friends and our family and everybody else.
Thank you. Neha, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I say this at every event I've ever been to, but I think it's so important to set boundaries, especially right now, and have a hard stop for when your workday begins and for when it ends. And so schedule your time in a way that these are the hours that you're working, and then schedule in something after work that really demarcates your personal life. So for me, it's ending my day with a walk or a workout. Again, figure out what works for you and be kind to yourself. This is, again, I'm going to use the word that we all love. This is unprecedented, and we're not going to be as productive as we were pre-COVID. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's about figuring out what works for you and just taking it day by day, and don't compare yourself to others. You know, I think a lot of us have gone down that sort of Instagram or social media comparison threshold, and it can be very toxic. And from an employer standpoint, accommodate your employees and listen to them and figure out how they work more productively and what works for them, and really have that sort of open communication between line managers and employees, and make sure that, you know, everyone is speaking to each other about these issues.
Thank you. Alicia, any final thoughts?
Sure. I would just say that I think that PR professionals are some of the most resilient humans on the planet. If you think about the kind of work that communications and PR people do, that most people could sort of move to a new job tomorrow in a totally different industry and learn the industry while they're implementing the tactics they already know. And because you all have that superpower built into what you do, I say use it to figure out how to be experts in the tactics of mental wellness, so that when the next wave of whatever is coming comes, when you have a personal crisis, or there's, heaven forbid, another global crisis, you have built in those mechanisms to protect yourself. You can be resilient and pivot over to where you need to be, taking all the good advice of all the very smart people on this call.
Thank you, Alicia. And Lynn, to finish us off, any final thoughts?
My colleagues have said so many wonderful things, and I imagine the attendees' brains are really full. And you're thinking about all kinds of things you'd love to do. But one thing that I think we haven't talked about enough is that it's really important to still look for joy in the world. Find the things that make you happy, that make you laugh, and make sure that that's part of your life, because that will fill you up and will help you to think about where, just to feel good. That's what we want sometimes, is just to feel good. I love humor and I love to laugh. Thankfully, I'm married to somebody who keeps me laughing almost all the time. But for those of you who don't have that kind of person that in your household, find the things that give you joy and laughter in addition to all this. It's not because we're in a somber, difficult time for many individuals, it doesn't mean that joy is gone as well. There are opportunities for that, and we can cultivate that in our lives. And that helps us to have some renewed energy and purpose as we face whatever challenges we're facing.